My name is Kaye Quinn, and I'm the author of Faery Swap. Faery Swap is a story about a boy who is tricked into swapping places with a runaway fairy prince. And today I'm going to talk to you about the fairies in my story and how they use mathematics to enhance their magical fairy powers. Then I'm going to talk to you about humans in the real world and how they use mathematics to do amazing things, and they don't even have magic to help them. Let's talk about warrior fairies and math magic. First, I'm going to tell you a bit about my story, then a bit about myself, and then we'll talk about how math is used in the real world. In my story, the human world was accidentally separated from the fairy world, which then spiraled off into another dimension that orbits around Earth. Once every 100 years, the fairy world comes around in its orbit close enough to the human world that the fairies can open a portal and come back to Earth for one day. During that day, the summer solstice, they swap places with humans in order to steal their latest math knowledge. That knowledge enhances their fairy magic, and the Fairy King needs strong magic for his plan to fuse the human and fairy worlds back together again. When the story starts, human boy Finn is tricked into swapping places with Zainir, the fairy prince who is running away from the fairy world. Unlike other fairies, Zainir is not trying to steal mathematical knowledge from the humans. He's trying to keep his father, the king, from getting his hands on it. Meanwhile, Zainir sends Finn's soul to the fairy world, where he encounters strange creatures called Spriggans. Finn has to figure out a way to get back home, but Zainir doesn't want to return to the fairy world. And warrior fairy princes like Zainir are very stubborn, especially when they possess your body. So that's what the story is about. But why did I decide to write Faery Swap? To answer that question, I'd like to tell you a bit about myself first. This is me now. This is me when I was in 7th grade. My hero back then was Sally Ride. She was the first woman to go into space, and I wanted to be just like her. I was good at math and science, so when I went to college, I got a lot of degrees in engineering. After college, I worked a lot of cool places like NASA and GE. I designed aircraft engines, and I studied global warming. That's me working at NASA, posing in front of Chuck Yeager's airplane. Chuck Yeager was the first test pilot to go faster than the speed of sound, and I got to hang out with some of the current test pilots when I was working at NASA. I had a lot of fun doing those engineering jobs, in case you can't tell. But a funny thing happened. I grew up, had my kids, and decided to start writing. I wrote and wrote and wrote. I wrote books for teens, I wrote books for adults, and eventually, after my 3 boys complained that I hadn't published any books for children, I wrote Faery Swap, a book for kids. But why would a person who loves engineering and math and science decide to write stories? Well, there are 2 sides to every person's brain, the left side and the right side. The left side you use for logic and reasoning. That was the side of my brain that liked working for NASA and understood equations. But I also liked using the right side of my brain. That's the side that likes to create new things, like my stories. What I really wanted to do was use both sides of my brain. In all my stories, I used the left side of my brain to create new inventions and futuristic technology, and the right side of my brain to write fun characters and interesting adventures. When I wrote Faery Swap, I was definitely using both sides to create a story that had both warrior fairies and math magic. You can see a lot of left brain stuff in Faery Swap. The fairies are seekers of knowledge, they command dimensional magic, and they seek out new physics and mathematics knowledge to enhance their fairy powers. First, they trick humans into swapping places with them. Then they steal the equations that will give them the enhanced knowledge and power that they want. Sometimes they have to use magic to get the knowledge that they want. But then they return to their fairy world, taking the new knowledge with them. They seek out the most powerful equations, like E equals mc squared. Does that equation look familiar to you? It's one of the most famous equations in the world. E equals mc squared was an equation developed by a guy named Einstein. Most of the world thinks of Einstein like this. I like to think of him more like this. He's laughing because no one before him was able to discover this very simple but very powerful equation. It's powerful because hidden in that simple equation is the idea that any matter, like an apple, has an incredible amount of energy stored inside it. Let's take a closer look at that equation and what it means. E equals mc squared says that energy equals mass times the speed of light, which is a very big number, squared, or multiplied by itself. Because the speed of light is such a big number, that means that even a tiny amount of mass has the energy to do this. This is one of the first nuclear weapons tested that was developed using the E equals mc squared equation. In other words, equations have a lot of power. Einstein was laughing because he discovered an equation that was simple enough to put on a t-shirt, but that had enough power to lead to the development of the nuclear bomb. But that equation wasn't just capable of destruction. It also helped us better understand how the universe works and led to the creation of PET scanners and other diagnostic techniques that help us save lives every year. That's an equation that truly has a lot of power. No wonder the fairies want those equations so badly and are willing to fight over them. And no wonder why Zainir is willing to do anything to keep them out of the hands of his father, the king, whose risky plan to fuse the worlds might put fairies and humans in danger. Faery Swap may be just a story, but I hope you understand now that the power that equations have is very real. If you want to learn more about the power of equations, check out my website. My downloadable teacher's guide has all kinds of discussion questions and activities related to Faery Swap. Plus, there's the Knowledge Seekers game, a card-based game you can play in class where students break into groups representing different fairy houses and compete to gain points by convincing a human to give them the knowledge cards. The knowledge cards are based on the 17 equations that change the world, and each give information about what the equation does, who invented it, and how it is used in everyday modern life. I hope you've learned something today, and I hope you keep learning every day. And remember, keep an eye out for fairies trying to trick you into swapping so they can steal your mathematical knowledge.